Good morning. This morning, we are going to look at Revelation chapter 21 and the second. We're looking at approximately verses 9 through 21. Of course, we'll need to cover some ground that we covered last week. But this week, last week we saw the new heavens and the new earth, and that's what we focused on there. This week, I want to focus on the New Jerusalem. So we have the eternal dwelling place of God and his people. That's what this is about, this New Jerusalem picture. And it's described in terms of, that would just be a delight to the first people who read Revelation in the first century. Because for these people, an abundant city would symbolize everything that was necessary to live and be satisfied in life. You got to remember, these people are living literally hand to mouth. If the rain doesn't come, people starve. That's how it works. They didn't have storehouses full of food. They didn't have a water fountain that never ran out, right? Because that's what they're some of that symbolism is about, the water of life, right? And so we have the city of pure gold that's laid out four square. It's laid out with four sides, is the idea of that word. And it's laid out not only as a square, but as a cube. And it's reflecting the dimensions of the innermost sanctuary of the temple and the tabernacle, that is the Holy of Holies. This is the place where the divine presence lived. And it shone with the glory of God in verse 11. Says, verse 10 says, "And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven for God, having the glory of God." This place is shining with the glory of God. Its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. So this could be referring to something clear like crystal, or maybe even a diamond. And so there's 12 gates on this city, and there's 12 gates on which are written the names of Israel, the tribes of Israel. And there's 12 stones that represent the 12 apostles. And these gates and these foundations represent the unity of God's ancient people with his New Testament people, the church, the new Israel. And so the city needs no temple. It says in verse 22, I realize we're not going to get there today, but the city doesn't need a temple because God and the Lamb are its temple, it says. And so inside the gates are those people whose names are written in the book of life. And now an angel draws John's attention, starting in verse 9 and 10. The angel is going to draw his attention to the contrast between the great prostitute, the wicked city of Babylon, and the bride of the Lamb, that is the holy city of the New Jerusalem. And so Babylon is the paradis, that's not the right word, paradis. Babylon is the paradis, and the tabernacle is the reality. And so now at the long last, God has come to dwell with his humans. That's verse 3, if we want to back up all the way to chapter 21 here in verse 3. "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God." You see, the bride that is the church is pure. She is lovely. She has been purified. She has been made holy, like I've been praying all throughout the service this morning, in the prayers that I gave, is for us to be pure, is for us to be holy, like Christ is holy, so that we can enjoy that close relationship with the Lamb. And now as we see the end, there's only one more chapter in Revelation now. The figure of the Lamb becomes even more prominent. In the next 22 verses here, the figure of the Lamb will show up 7 times. It's once every 3 verses. And so now as we move on to verses 10 through 14 here, in the Greek, this is all one long run-on or compound sentence. And so we can see verses, especially 10 through 14, as one section. And this section describes this new Jerusalem that's coming down from heaven. And in this vision, the angel transports John to this great and high mountain to watch this majestic city come down. And this mountain, we've seen this mountain before in chapter 17. Sorry, not in chapter 17. When John is taken to the desert, we see bad things happen. But when we see mountains, we see good things happening in Revelation. Because it's from the high mountain that he views this new Jerusalem. You have to remember, that in Jewish thought, mountains, especially the higher they are, the more holy they are, is the idea. The high mountain plays a significant role in their thought process. Moses, right? Moses' historical encounter with God on Mount Sinai is going to mark the origin of this Jewish nation, right? Of Israel. That's Exodus chapter 19. And Ezekiel's great vision that we read this morning during Bible class of a restored temple in chapter 34, and a restored city in 34, and a restored land. Ezekiel sees the same vision on a very high mountain. Ezekiel chapter 40, verses 1 through 2. Ezekiel chapter 40 begins his temple vision, this temple that no longer is on just the Temple Mountain, but now encompasses the whole city, which is this whole mountain now. And of course, we have Isaiah's mountain of the Lord, right? In chapter 2, in Mount Zion there. And so the city comes down from God, and what that means is that the eternal blessedness is not an achievement of the people, but as a gift from God. And so the angel tells us that he's now going to show us the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And we already know from the scriptures that we already know what's going to be described to us, whether it's from chapter 3 or earlier. We know that the bride is defined as the saints, God's holy people. And so the description that the angel gives us is not a description of a literal new city that's going to be built in Palestine. What does he describe for us in verse 15? He picks up with the measurements of the city. And this is a reference back to Zechariah. Let's look at Zechariah real quick. I'm on the wrong side there. Haggai, Zechariah. And it's interesting, it's very interesting that Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi all talk about this temple or New Jerusalem being rebuilt. We're looking at Zechariah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. The builders of this new city. Because Haggai is going to begin preparing to build the temple. But let's read what he says here in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. On the 21st of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people, saying, Who is left among you who saw the temple in its former glory? How do you see it now? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? This temple they were building was nothing in comparison. But now, take courage, Zerubbabel, declares Yahweh. Take courage also, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and all you people in the land, take courage, declares Yahweh, and work, for I am with you, says the Lord of hosts. For the promise which I made to you when you came out of Egypt was that my spirit is abiding in your midst. Do not fear. And of course, that was Haggai chapter 2, and I said Zechariah chapter 2. Let's try that again, this time in Zechariah. I was wondering why that wasn't quite matching up. Sorry about that. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and this is Zechariah having a vision because he's patrolling all of the earth. And now he comes to this Mount Zion in chapter 2, and he sees God's mountain. And he sees God's special favor for this mountain of the Lord. Then he lifted up my eyes, and I looked, and behold, there was a man with a measuring line in his hand. Man, that sounds familiar, kind of like in Revelation. So I said, where are you going? And he said to me, to measure Jerusalem, to see how wide and how long it is. And behold, the angel who was speaking with me going out, and another angel was coming out to meet him. And he said to him, Run, speak to that young man, saying, Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls because of the multitude of men and cattle within it. Man, that's kind of the opposite picture that we have in Revelation. For I, declares Yahweh, will be a wall of fire around her, and I will be the glory in her midst. The same picture of measuring is picked up here in Zechariah, that John shows us here in verse 15. And the measuring happens again in Revelation in chapter 11, when John is told to go and measure. And that measuring then was to ensure protection over his people. So measuring, like in Zechariah, God as a wall of fire is measuring God's protection around them. Here, the measuring, though, is different. Because the gates are always open on this city, we find out later. So how is there protection if the gates are always open? Well, here, these measurements are to show us this enormous size and this perfect symmetry of the city, of the eternal dwelling place of God and his faithful people. And verse 16 here makes it a little more clear. The city is not only vast in terms of its footprint, 1,500 or 1,400 miles each way, but that number was roughly the same distance as the Roman Empire. And I think that's part of the point. But it's also 1,500 miles high. And John, of course, has no thought of what kind of buildings are going to make up this city, right? He's constructing a symbolic universe. He's not constructing an architectural drawing for us. And so the city is going to be enormous. It's going to be this perfect cube, because that's the shape of the Holy of Holies at the heart of the ancient temple that we looked at Thursday during Bible class in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 20. And so the whole city has become God's dwelling place, or God's temple, or more exactly, the very center of God's temple, the Holy of Holies, the place where God dwells with his people forever, that was formerly inaccessible. This is why the city has the glory of God. Verse 11, right, of Revelation. The city has the glory of God because God is there with them. That doesn't just mean that it's a wonderful thing to look at, right? That it's kind of like sunlight, like, oh, I'm glad I don't have to pay a power bill because God's here. That's not what this is about, right? It means that God's glory, his own glorious presence, is there. It's gleaming from every stone and every jewel, and the streets that are made of gold but somehow are like glass, right? It's also why the city comes down out of heaven from God. This is a great new reality that John is seeing, that the place of God's dwelling is on earth in this city. And it can never be something that humans make, right? That takes us back to Babylon or Babel, the Tower of Babel, where we try to attain that God-like status by our own works and our own achievements. But this is a gift of God and his love and his grace for us. And so I want to show some of the overlap in Ezekiel this morning. I don't have time to hit every single one of these, so if you want to go back and check the video, you can, and you can pause it here and you can read. I apologize for the people here. It's a little bit hard to read on the chart behind me, but if you want a printout of this, I can get you one of those also. Ezekiel seems to be fascinated with the Garden of Eden, especially these images that he's trying to describe are of the Garden of Eden. He mentions Eden repeatedly in his poetry. And much of his hope is, or much of his hope for a renewed creation is inspired by this garden and temple imagery that is combined. And I personally would contend that the various stories that we have, or the various forms of narrative of the temple and of the garden and of creation in the Old Testament are intended to point to that final temple, that final creation, that new creation where God's presence is filling and dwelling with the entire creation in a way that at one time it only filled the garden. And at one time, it only filled the Holy of Holies. But now, with the building of this temple that then expands from the Holy of Holies to the city of Jerusalem in Ezekiel to now 1,400 miles, I believe what we're seeing here is that we're seeing this figurative prophetic temple that's being built. And if we're going to use that building language, you need, in their mind, you need a cornerstone to be built on, right? That's Ephesians chapter 2. We looked at that in Bible class. And who or what is that cornerstone? It's Christ. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens. Who was a stranger and an alien? Someone who lived outside of the city. Someone who lived outside of your people group. But you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, having been built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. So Christ is the cornerstone in whom the whole building is being fitted together into a holy temple of the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into the dwelling place of the Spirit, or in the Spirit. So during the present age, during right now, the very existence of the church is evidence for, or the very existence of the church is the witness, is the evidence for the invisible temple that conveys the presence of God to others, either in blessing or in judgment. And so Ezekiel is seeing a much larger reality than the one just localized in a particular structure in Jerusalem. Let's look at Ezekiel chapter 40 real quick. Ezekiel chapter 40 and verse 1 and 2. This is going to be important because John sees something very similar, and his commission in verse 10 is very similar here to verses 1 and 2. He says, "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there. In the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel, and he set me on a very high mountain, and on it, to the south, there was a structure like a city." Now let's skip ahead to the end of the vision. So that's the very beginning of the vision. Let's skip ahead to the end of the vision. Ezekiel chapter 48 and verse, towards the end, verse 30. Well, let's just read verse 35. "And the city shall be 18,000 cubits round about. And the name of the city from that day shall be, The Lord is There." So here we have this city, and the name of the city is The Lord is There. So the Lord is dwelling there. And these boundaries, Ezekiel chapter 40 and Ezekiel chapter 48, act like boundaries, where the temple is equivalent to the city because the whole city is filled with God's presence that at one time only filled the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary there of Israel's temple or tabernacle. In Jeremiah, we mentioned this during Bible class. Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 14. Jeremiah, where was I? 15, 16, and 17. It says, "Then I will give you a shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you on knowledge and understanding. And it shall be in those days, when you are multiplied and increased in the land, declares the Lord, they shall say no more, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And it shall not come to mind, nor shall they remember it, nor shall they miss it, nor shall it be made again. At that time they shall call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all the nations will be gathered to it, to Jerusalem, for the name of the Lord. Nor shall they walk any more after the stubbornness of their own evil heart." Similar to what John is saying here, there's not an Ark of the Covenant anymore, because the Ark won't be remembered anymore in this restoration that is to come, because God's throne, getting tongue-tied, because God's throne is there. God's throne is going to expand from this Holy of Holies, like Clint said, it's turned out and it's spreading out to cover at minimum Jerusalem here. And then by the time we get to Revelation, it's spreading out over 1,400 miles now. The throne of the Lord will be where all nations are gathered together, because the Lord is in Jerusalem. Ezekiel 43 and verse 7 says the same thing. And so what does this New Jerusalem represent then? Well, due to our previous studies, I could say conclusively that we have ruled out a city somewhere in Palestine. So what does this New Jerusalem represent to these people then, or to us? Well, there are three main views in traditions that are similar to what we look like as we worship in the church. The primitive gospel, the gospel of the first century church, there's three main views. And the first is that this is somehow a picture of heaven itself. The second is that the New Jerusalem is somehow a metaphor for only the church, nothing physical, only people. And the third one, and this is my point of view, which is why we'll spend the most time looking at it, is that this New Jerusalem represents what is faithful and true. He says it twice here in Revelation, and he says it before each time when he speaks of the New Jerusalem. Let's go through them one at a time. Some people say, or I would even go to say, the majority say that this is a picture of heaven itself. That 3 times, the problem is, with that view though, is that 3 times the city is described as coming down out of heaven. Revelation chapter 3, Revelation chapter 21 in verse 2, and then today in Revelation 21 and verse 10. It's coming down out of heaven to a new earth that's promised by God. Right? That's 2 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 1 here. The new heavens and new earth. And so it's viewed by John. The city is viewed by John from a great high place. So he's looking out at this city thing. So the city is, in my mind, distinguished from heaven itself. But it is the present dwelling place of God. And so I can't say that this is a picture of heaven, this New Jerusalem. So how does it represent a metaphor for the church, though? Some people see the New Jerusalem as a metaphor for the church. Well, it says that it's the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And I would agree that the New Jerusalem is made up of these people. But I would also say that it's not limited to that, because there's a distinction here made between the city and the people of the city, right? The nations who are coming in verse 24. I know that's kind of skipping ahead. By its light will the nations walk. All the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. And so this city also has gates on it where people come in and out of. And so I think there's more to the picture than only people. I think there's something here, a promise that's for us, that is not a physical city in Palestine, that is not only God and his people, but that it is what is faithful and true. That this is a prophecy that is trustworthy. That this is a city whose builder and maker is God, a city that we are seeking after, that is now in heaven, but that is to come at some point. It is the place that Jesus spoke of to his disciples. John chapter 14. Let's look at that real quick. Luke, John 14. We're going to be studying John in about 3 weeks is my estimation, or maybe a little bit longer if you have some topical lessons between Revelation and John. We could bring up some topical things, but John chapter 14 and verses 1 through 3. Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And of course, both main views, people who see this as heaven and people who see this as a new heavens and new earth, say, see, it means what I want it to mean. The question is, where is he also? In Revelation, it says that he came down to dwell in the city. And you know the way to where I am going. And of course, Thomas says, I don't know the way. What are you talking about? Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It reminds us of the Lamb's book of life. People in the city are alive because of the Lamb's blood. The life is in the blood. He gave that blood up for us to give us life. And so I view the new heavens and the new earth, and especially the new Jerusalem, as a current reality. The foundation has been laid. Christ is the cornerstone. We went over this in Bible class, but we have Christ being the cornerstone in Ephesians. Also in Ephesians, we have the apostles and the prophets together teaching us, laying the foundation that now we can build on. And so if we put John's glasses on and we look out into the world, we can build the city of God right now. We can start the building process because we have a promise that is made to us. I gave an example on Thursday. If everybody remembers the man who promised his 5-year-old son a horse and a buggy in 1900. Well, 1925 comes along and his son's getting married and he buys him a car. Did he follow through with his promise? Yes, because he wanted the best for his son. He wanted good transportation for his son. And so that's something like that that's going on for us. We can only see the horse and buggy because we only know the reality that is around us. But that thing that will come out of heaven, here in Revelation 21, to be a part of this new earth where God and the Lamb are going to dwell, is going to be for eternity. God is going to dwell with us through the Lamb for eternity in this new city. And so we have the full overlap now, the circles that are overlapping. I finally found the picture I was looking for. The full overlap of heaven and earth. And so let's back up and let's talk big picture now as we close out. God created the cosmos. That's that Greek word for all of creation. God created the cosmos to be his great temple. It's evident in the structure of how he created things. And he rests after his great creative work to rule over his creation. But his presence has not so far filled the entire earth because in the storyline, who was supposed to go and take his presence out and fill the earth? That was man. His co-ruler, he's called. That he's supposed to follow through with this job, to go and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with the beautiful presence of God. And so God has installed this co-ruler in the sanctuary, garden sanctuary, and he put him there to extend the boundaries of God's presence worldwide. But Adam disobeyed that mandate, right? So humanity no longer enjoys the presence of God in the garden, in the safety of the garden. And as a result, all of humanity and all of creation is now separated from God. We are contaminated with sin. And all of our human attempts to extend God's presence throughout this earth have been, at the very best, limited successes, right? The tabernacle didn't quite work out. It wasn't because of God. And so the temple, we'll build something bigger and better, right? We'll build this temple. And that didn't work out. Because they started using the temple as this lucky rabbit's foot, like, I went and gave my sacrifices, therefore God's going to protect me. So the successful fulfillment of Adam's commission to be fruitful and multiply, the successful fulfillment of that waited for the last Adam to come and fulfill that. That's Jesus Christ, the last Adam. And so later in the story of Israel, after the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed, God's Spirit then played this key role in the future hope of the prophets, right? Because the temple's destroyed, and so they're giving all these prophecies about the temple being rebuilt. Only the temple that they rebuild looks nothing like the prophecies. And so when Ezekiel imagines a new temple and a new obedient Israel, he knew that both would have to be the work of God's Spirit, that they couldn't do it themselves. They tried to do that with the Tower of Babel, right? And so when Ezekiel sees a new and obedient Israel, he doesn't see some new creation like God starting over with a new garden and a new Adam. What do we see in Ezekiel 36? In that valley of dry, what? Bones. We find the promise that God's creative presence is going to one day come and live in his people again. Just like it lived in the temple and in the tabernacle. Ezekiel believed that God's spirits would recreate the hearts of the people, would bring new life. Just like he breathed life into Adam, he breathes life onto these bones. It's the same words that are used there in Ezekiel 36. That wind, remember that wind is the same word as breath, the ruach. And he would recreate in the hearts of his people life so that they could truly be in that fellowship and love and obedience to him. So after that amazing promise, we find Ezekiel 37, right? Which is the vision that explores that spirit-filled humanity, right? Ezekiel 37 is the valley of the dry bones. So sorry, I got that backwards. Because Ezekiel is replaying Genesis chapter 2 and in the creation account. And God's Spirit comes to enliven these dead human bodies. But instead of bringing life to some new human, right, like he did in the garden, God's Spirit fills this valley of dead bodies, remaking them as new humans. And then as the fulfillment or the culmination, the high point of God's rescue mission, in Ezekiel promises then to make an everlasting covenant. We read that this morning. To make an everlasting covenant with this recreated people, to put his Spirit among them forever. I forgot to write down what verse that was, but that's Ezekiel 37, I think. And so these Old Testament passages like these from Ezekiel were the foundation, and they were foundational statements for the apostles, for Jesus, we read in John chapter 14, for Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, for Paul in Romans chapter 8, when he says all of creation will be renewed and will follow after God in a new covenant. So Jesus, Peter, and Paul are establishing this new covenant people of God that are renewed people. They're not newly created people. They are people that have been cleansed, that have been brought up from the grave through the power of Christ and his Spirit as the building blocks of this temple. That's you and me. That's the promise that's made for us. That's the promise that we have in Revelation 21 now. That's the promise that we need to take into the world. That we too can live in peace, in harmony, in this beautiful city. If we would allow the Spirit to remake us, to bring us back to life. The symbol of baptism is the symbol of going down into the grave. The watery grave of baptism, we call it. And when you come up out of the water, you're a new person. You have been enlivened with the Spirit. You have been made holy in the presence of God. And now you are a building block in the temple. If you need the prayers of the church, or if you need those waters of baptism, we can help you with that this morning. If you are listening online and you need some help with that, contact me at sitkachurch@gmail.com, or if you're in Sitka, just come by the building here and we can help you with that. Thanks, everybody, for coming this morning. We'll look at Revelation and chapter 22 next week, along with the end of chapter 21. Have a good morning, everyone.